So hi everyone, I am Christina and I'm here with my colleague Lala Darchinova, and this is the second episode, second webinar in our newly established educational series of webinars on peace and conflict studies, which we started with a goal to discuss together different concepts and phenomena from peace and conflict studies and try to understand them together and see what they can give to us peace practitioners and conflict analysts and practitioners in the South Caucasus. And today's topic is pretty broad and pretty complex, and we had hardship to filter out different themes that we would like to share today during this 1 hour long webinar. And it is on violence. What is violence? And we found it important to and interesting right now to discuss, as we are surrounded with a world where violence erupts all around the world in different contexts, and we observe it, and it's all in the media, and it's discussed widely among in the societies, among people, and for some it's even a reason for polarization, as people take different positions on what violence is justified and what is not. So we decided to discuss together, first classify and understand what types of violence we have in our surrounding, in social life, in social and political life, and also discuss together what types of violences there are that we don't notice often. So as I said, I'm Christina. I'm co-director at the Imagine Center, project co-director at the Imagine Center, together with Lala, and co-editor at Caucasus Edition. Lala, if you would like to say a few words.
Yes, thank you, Christina, for a great introduction. I'm also co-editor at the Caucasus Edition and project co-director at the Imagine Center. And we decided to keep this webinar in a conversational format because this is a very heated debate, and everyone, including all the scholars and in Syria, there are a lot of different opinions. So we will try to build a dialogue around these different opinions and views on violence and see how it goes. And we also rely on our audience for questions. And if you feel like at the end you will have a opinion or comment or question to ask, please feel free to join us. So first 30 minutes we'll start the conversation with Christina, and then we'll open the floor for the audience to basically join us. So Christina, would you like to start?
Sure. The plan that we have today with Lala for you is, I will give, looking at our audience, I'm sure that everyone is familiarized with different approaches to understanding violence, and yet we'll try to categorize them right now together, and then based on that, start the conversation about expressions of violence in today's world, and how we approach them. So probably the most straightforward way to start the conversation about what is violence, to me, is actually Galtung's really broad and neutral definition about violence is something that that hinders or limits one's potential for realization. And what does that mean? Of course, the most obvious one is physical limitation, with personal violence, as he calls it, with physical abuse or beating or killing that we can see physically happening, and this kind of expressions that are usually also very widely covered, and we also see that also with the new media on social media and in our phones. But beyond that, what is important to discuss, and where also Galtung goes beyond personal violence, he looks into what does he mean by potential realization of our potential? Does it really only about physical expressions of violence? What about lack of education, or inaccessibility of healthcare or water, or any other similar forms of inaccess to things or infrastructure to which people need for their lives? If centuries ago there would be no cure for certain disease, then dying from it would be unfortunate but would not be considered a violence. And yet, when now there is the cure for that certain disease, but there is no access to that medical support or that cure, then according to Galtung, and we would agree, this kind of inaccessibility would be called violence, or more precisely and widely known as structural violence, where there is inaccess to different kinds of supports to life that people should have. I apologize. So Lal, would you help me with this part on structural violence, and how, if you have any examples in your mind on this?
Yes, thanks a lot about bringing the structural violence, and this leads me to a discussion and questions about the basically the nature of violence, whether we should consider the violence something natural or something socially constructed, because a lot of discussions in theory and also in our social life is built around the belief that violence is something natural and we basically cannot avoid it. I would like to actually propose or bring some different kind of angles to this question. It's whether making an essentialist assumption on violence is a right way to understand how we are understanding this phenomenon. So what I'm trying to say is the nature of human being having an aggression or the negative traits basically are reduced to the inevitable fate of being and organizing our political community always in a violent form. And that's why many structures are justified just based on this proposition that this is in our nature. But for me, the question would be more like how we organize this violence. Again, I think many things depend on the socialization and social organizing of humans. And if we look at the different examples in different, for example, indigenous societies, how they organize and their political life and what kind of groups can have the access and power over the violence, it gives us a bit a different picture of organization of society. And why this is important? Because as you mentioned about the healthcare system, about education and access to the jobs and other social goods, in many cases, we currently don't even regard and think about these things as a violence, as violent structures that actually cause a lot of pain, kill and poverty, killings and poverty to people, to individuals. And when we are thinking about violence, we immediately think about the direct physical violence, and we don't even go into now there are a lot of discussions about the psychological aspects of violence, etc., right? But still the structural aspect is a bit neglected. So I think we with Christina try to design this talk in a way that to address the structural nature of violence and to bring that into conversation today.
And to jump on that, as you mentioned about psychological violence, similarly, very often it is especially important to talk about structural violence when it comes to understanding causes of certain violent acts. And I know this is also very controversial approach to that, especially when it's discussed on the media. But it is very important to look at the structural causes of different violent eruptions. And one really basic, because you mentioned psychological violence, that's why it came to my mind. But really simple example is with bullying, and bullying at school, for example. If a bully boy, a teenager, is really is that bullying a violent eruption, which of course needs to be condemned, needs to be explained, that is a bad behavior influencing others. However, I think even there we'll really look at the physical expression of physical or more authoritarian ways of violence committed by states especially, but it's neglected how more subtle the violence has become. And here I think it would be important also to discuss discourses and knowledge, or how Foucault would say truth telling, as also violence that is committed. Or I also really like the term by Judith Butler about normative violence, where norms are defined on how people or certain groups or populations in general should act and in what order should they be, which of course also creates certain hierarchies of I know, Lala, you will also be talking about this, so I'll jump ahead a bit, but who should live or who should die or who should live better than the others, and all of this is also part of the ordering that is happening, and of course it happens really in very subtle ways, and of course on top of this also kind of economic systems also contribute to this, and this is again another type of violence that we tend to ignore as it becomes normalized, and we also internalize and normalize it for us. And of course here we can go milder, trying to shift all these norms and orders, which I think I see happening really slow, and yet I don't know, Lal, maybe you would add to this. What do you think about if there are any structures or any forms of rule or governance that can be free from violence? How would that look like?
Thank you. I think the primary question for me would be that there is not a question, but probably the answer would be no, there wouldn't be any. But the question is how we organize it, and who controls this means of violence, who have a say around it, and yeah, these are the main questions basically, and what kind of role, to what kind of violence we as a society pay attention. So, for example, in our today's political organization, the primary means of violence are controlled by the state. Think, for example, of armies or police, and the most the most spread argument is that we are living in non-violent societies, and any, for example, dissatisfaction with the structures that we live in should be addressed in a non-violent way. So, and honestly, there are very little ways how, for example, citizens, or let's take an example of Georgia, who have a protest these days on the streets. Very little prospect for citizens, for example, to use any violent means, while the state can easily exercise this violence. And then the question is, do we still have any say in organization of this violence, or it's like given to us as a natural form and we don't even question these forms? And this is also applied to wars, for example, which our region witnessed and are suffering for quite a time. We don't control this. We don't have a say over this, and these wars are the most organized forms of the violence again, and they are also a very alienating forms of violence, because you don't know even who you are violently fighting against, or for what cause you are fighting, actually. And many people are not even signing up for this cause, but are basically urged or don't have any other choice, and they end up being in this structure without a choice. And I'm not saying that everyone is like that. I'm pretty sure that there is people who are buying into this nationalist framework and going there with the on a voluntary basis, but at the same time there are people who are just trapped into this system without getting out of it. Having said this, I think these are the obvious forms of, let's say, structural violence, but I think you were going to mention about the discourses and more subtle forms of violence. Maybe you will talk maybe a bit about this, and I have comments on that ideas, which I'll say for later.
Yes, I'm muted. So sure. Really shortly, because I think we've planned more than we can cover today. But then maybe during the Q&A session we'll cover that. But it is truly important to look at different discourses and how they organize our lives. But now actually something that you mentioned, and I'll probably connect it to that as well. Is the wars and the recent second, well, hopefully the last Nagorno-Karabakh war that we witnessed in 2020. It just that you mentioned it, and with discourses, I remembered how it was lived and experienced. For example, in Yerevan, is in a city center. It really was discursively, it was made into as if we are watching a football match. So you would actually walk around the city center, and for example, cafes would have boards where they would just keep count of Azerbaijani soldiers, tanks, or whatever that is killed and demolished, as if first no Armenians are dying in the process, even if we look from a nationalist perspective, but also as if each death is like a football goal, a score in a match, and it was absolutely desensitized. And of course, the media that I keep mentioning today has, I think, has changed a lot how we perceive violence and wars all around, or all of that Telegram channels that would an insane amount of violent visuals and content that would be disseminated. But this has also seeped into the actual discourse and the overall narrative about wars and how they happen. And as you also mentioned, and there's this concept of new wars, how new wars are happening, and with technological advancement, they are really happening from afar through drones and drone wars that we also got accustomed to in the region, where you don't really even see the enemy whom you are killing, and you are committing that violence towards. Yeah, and on a different note now, a bit disconnected from that, as you asked about discourses, I think it's also but actually you had something to add to that. Maybe you do, and then I'll continue with the about states.
Yeah, okay. I will first comment on this narrative around the football match narrative around the keyboard. I think it was pretty similar in Azerbaijan as well. It turned into some, computer game when through social media and also traditional TVs and traditional media, the images of drone shootings and killings were presented to the wider society. And it's alienation to the level that you don't even perceive that you are killing a human being. It looks like you are in a game and in a kind of simulation, and you cannot even build any kind of empathy with the side that is there that you are fighting, because it's no longer in a direct physical violence or direct physical interaction. So yeah, I just wanted to underline the similarities that we had during these wars. And About the discourses, I think you mentioned it about a bit earlier about truth telling and this discursive violence. I think what I mentioned to add to that, what I wanted to add to that is that along with this discursive violence and also along with the disciplinary violence that we are having in societies, there is also a very gradual movement to societies of control where we no longer are disciplined, but we are the violence is actually is becoming more subtle, I would say, in a way that we are voluntarily participating in these structures. For example, how is our data collected, or offering us, for example, illusions of choice. For example, the consumerism can be a good example to this, and we don't even realize that we are in some discursively violent system, and we voluntarily from now on participate in this. So there is even no need to discipline us in societies. That's what I wanted to add to your comments.
Mm-hmm. And actually, interestingly, I was right before the webinar thinking about how human rights, how they evolved actually against, oh, well, at that time, royalty, and then how kind of liberalism came about as an ideology, and then how states actually turn them reverse. So they are actually granting human rights, and they are the guarantors of human rights. Well, functionally it works right now that way, but it also took away from people their political agency. So it also grants you that political agency or not, which is also pretty structurally violent process where there is the state, and that's probably the last maybe theme we could discuss, because it's also a common narrative and understanding, of course, from realist perspective, common international relations, that the state, kind of the statist tradition, that state is the legitimate holder of violence, of committing violence. And there is this view, Arendt's view, that I appreciate, that it says that actually holders of this tradition, they understand violence really well, but they do not understand politics and legitimacy in that terms. However, why I'm mentioning also Arendt, because I think, Lal, maybe you would disagree with that view, and I'm curious to hear what you would say about state and state violence. That Arendt also criticizes anti-statist tradition of those that see violence as legitimate way towards freedom, for fight for freedom. She says that they don't really understand both. They don't understand. They use violence, however, it can be justified. This is how she says it, and I appreciate it, that violence can be justified, but it can't grant legitimacy. So in long run, it doesn't give power and legitimacy. And she also criticizes Fanon in this terms. And I don't know if you would like to say a few words on how he sees violence and what's that tradition of thinking.
Yeah, this is a very relevant point. I think, first of all, about this state granting the rights and our alienation. I think Marx calls it really alienation, in a way that, and he brings the parallels with Christian thinking, saying that before it was God who was giving the rights, and now we just replaced God with the state, and basically like giving this metaphorical analogy of how we are still alienated from agency and political agency, where we can fully exercise our potential. And about what Arendt said and violence, this is, I think, on a leftist or more critical perspective, this is about violence. I think it's also very, very debatable topic with different views, although the prevalent view is that violence is justified. And if we refer to Fanon again, I think Fanon says that if there is a very structural violent system, there is no way basically you overthrow it through non-violent means. And he refers to colonialism and or let's say other forms of colonialism like apartheid. And indeed, for example, what we are witnessing today in Palestinian case, it is framed around the logic that this is a fight against colonialism, settler colonialism, and you cannot fight against this violent structure without bringing the violence, basically. But there are also criticisms of these violent approaches on the left as well, saying that our means basically should be in accordance with our ends. So if our ends is a non-violent society, our means cannot be violent. And similar would be to Arendt's argument in that sense that violence will bring violence and basically there is no end. You will not be able to justify your legitimacy afterward. But yeah, I will not. I will refrain to pose my any own personal opinion, because I will just introduce this different views, because I think there is no definitive answer to that. And one of the ways is that you tactically decide if there is basically a violent backlash against the resistance from the power holders, let's say, then basically violence is just induced on you and you have no other ways than just to violently respond. But this is very different when you incite violence yourself, and you are the very well-known tactics of the terrorists, of guerrilla fights, or I don't know, like insurrections. So these are very controversial topics, but yeah. Yeah, maybe we can take some questions from audience if you don't have, maybe you have some.
Sure. No, I was going to suggest to open the floor now for questions. And see what our audience.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you for this discussion. I think it's very long overdue that we've discussed this specifically for our region. I mean, I know we get very much trapped into doing things and addressing immediate needs, and there's really not a lot of time to sit back and think about things conceptually. Some in your discussion, you've touched upon some of the things that I am asking in my question, but I wanted to kind of have a little bit more focused discussion about how hate speech, patriotic or nationalistic narratives, propaganda feeds into this concept of violence in the South Caucasus. We, for a very long time, we had a period of relative in the region overall. We had a period of absence of widespread direct violence, and then we had 2008 in Georgia, and then 2020 in Armenia and Azerbaijan and onwards. But so how hate speech kind of fits into all of this, and I want to hear your kind of opinion based on your practice and your experience. Do you think that prolonged periods of hate speech in building up this discourse is actually more damaging for the societies rather than the burst outs or the episodes of war and direct violence, and what it means for our practice? Thank you.
Chris, you want to go first? Or
maybe you. I have a comment about the second part of the question.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Margarita, for the question. I think this is very relevant. I would put it into the discursive violence. And for me, this is like how the discourse and in many cases also the ideology around conflict is built. Like you need to strengthen the nationalist feelings, you need to build the national identity. And unfortunately, in many cases, and in our region specifically, it was built around the hatred, it was built around the conflict, it was built around the violence. And I agree that this is something that many times is neglected as not and is not perceived as violence at all, building these discourses around the very exclusionary ideologies, even though, for example, this is not a hate speech per se. For example, I'm not saying I'm acknowledging that there is hate speech, but for example, there are discourses that around nationalism can be not specifically framed in hate speech, but still it's an exclusionary politics, and neglecting this as not violent and not questioning this as through the lens of violence. I think this is something we really miss in the region, and I think this leads to a basically extended conflict that we cannot even end this, because it's already, like, I don't know, more than 3 decades that this discourse continues of enmity and hate speech and exclusionary nationalism continues. And what it says, for example, for our work as peace practitioners, I think it means it moves our work predominantly to discursive ends. Basically, we try to fight always this nationalistic rhetoric, counter it, and build our own discourse around it. But in many cases, we honestly, I think, fail, because we're a smaller community, and we even try to build this type of narratives with smaller community. These people again go back to their broader nationalistic discourses and disappear, basically. So yeah, this is what I want to say.
Yeah, thank you, Lala. I think you said most of what I would want to say about discourses. Maybe 2 things that I would only add to this is that, I will not invent anything if I say that discourses, and especially those that are state-sponsored, therefore they have the most influence on us, and are the most widespread. They also decide on, again, as I mentioned, how we should act or how we should not act, which also put taboos on any questioning of nationalism in general. But even if you identify yourself as a nationalist, even within that scope, criticizing certain actions or not, what is allowed to be done or what not, and to just make myself clear, make my point clearer, what I have in mind. And I know this is extremely controversial topic right now and very sensitive, but I will still bring this example. There was in the Armenian media now regarding demarcation, where protesters and villagers have a short argument, and just this disclaimer, there is no like tension between villagers, like there are no clashes or strong disagreement between that villagers and the protesters that are against the demarcation process. But the villager says that, shouldn't I know where my village ends? Shouldn't I know where is the line that I should not cross? And one of the protesters says, hey, it's not your village's border, it's the country's border. So there is a difference. So you can't really claim it for your village, whereas kind of the statement posed by the villager was pretty like functional in terms of everyday life. He wanted to understand his everyday life's territorial limits. I know it's probably not the best formulation, and yet it was he was not questioning really the Armenia, maybe even the claims on against demarcation, and yet it was again met with the like more hardcore nationalist position that actually this is a kind of countries' borders and kind of countries' more abstract, wider understanding of country and the state is more important than your everyday life's security question that the man was posing. Yeah. Should we take the next question?
Yeah.
Shall I read it and then maybe you try to respond? Because what do you think about being forced, in quotes, to commit violence? Or in other words, is violence ever justified? Ever a justified response?
Okay.
I think this is one of the questions that we always together discuss and probably do not have a answer to it, but
yeah, I think this is what we touched at the end by discussing Fanon. Again, I think my position would be, and also there is many people writing on this in the literature, that if you are forced to commit violence, then it can be justified. So basically, if you are not pacifist, not believing that you are not exercising violence under any circumstances, then in under the name of self-defense, or under the name of when you are attacked and you don't have any other option, or you are forced by structural means like colonialism or apartheid to fight it by violent means, then I think this is something basically justified. And by being forced, it's not, I don't understand it particularly in a very direct or physical sense. It's also structures that forces you, by not giving you any other option, or by not giving you any freedom to fight the structure under other enemies. So this is for me like being forced. Again, let's think about Israel and Palestine. Let's think about the apartheid regime in South Africa. This is the structures or situations when basically under such kind of injustices you are experiencing every day, or violence you're experiencing every day, you are left with no other option than to violently fight against these structures. I don't know whether this was the question, and I could cover it. Chris, maybe you want to cover?
I mean, I think it's you. I also don't have like a clear answer to that question. But I think it's usually debatable whether that was kind of the last way. Violence was the only option in certain situations, and yet what again makes me still think that there are certain context, and again also you mentioned that it's important to look case by case, but what I have in mind is actually pretty physical violence case of domestic violence, and when women, for example, women then violently respond, or maybe not even violently respond, but sometimes even pre-planned violently deal with the situation by committing violence against their husbands or men that was abusing them. And there, I don't really, I don't feel like I have, the privilege to say that that violence could be, unjustified. And that's really, and now I'm thinking out loud, that's probably the main case of violence that really makes me to start to think about, okay, what are that cases when violence is really the only way around, considering the context. Also, this is not really about if it's just or not, but about being forced into violence. I think there are also many context, especially with kind of internal civil wars. I remember Colombian case, I think, where sometimes villagers are the only economic, the only way for resources to have access to economic resources is actually to join a gang. And there is, of course, we can think of many other different scenarios what a person could do in that, in order to avoid joining a gang or engaging in that violence, but sometimes we do that really from a privileged perspective and points where you really have more options than that one. But yeah, again, this is not really a clear-cut answer to if it's justified or not. And I think there are a few questions about that. Yeah, well.
To very short comment to what you said in the end about privileged position. I think non-violent means and the discourse about non-violence is mostly criticized from a perspective that this is a privileged position. And saying when you are in a privileged again position, when, for example, you are not a person who is beaten at home, as you mentioned, or you're not the person who is experiencing, for example, 10 police checkpoints every day, going just to go from home to the work, or cannot even speak in their own language. I don't know, like, every day seeing the discrimination, or living in a very, very poor conditions. Like, let's talk about the economic violence here as well. So we don't know. Yeah, we cannot fully. We can emphasize, I think, and that's why probably a lot of series around justifying violence emerge. But just saying to that people that you don't have a right, or you shouldn't be violently defending or fighting. I think I also cannot say that, because for me it's also coming from a very privileged position. That's why most of the critique about nonviolent actions emphasizes this privilege element as well.
Yeah, and yet I feel like I want to comment that there are cases, and I feel like both of us are arguing that there are cases when violence could be justified, and yet I really want to return to that argument that it still should not be legitimized. It should not be normalized as a way of politics, which I think is right now.
Should we move to another question?
Sure. So there is, I think, series of questions. Let me try. So I read them. I don't know if you have read them, but I will try to summarize them. So kind of the argument was that we are a bit contradicting ourselves in terms of if violence is not avoidable. Which I would argue, I think we also covered that it can be justified, but usually we argue that it's avoidable. Anyway, so it's about state violence. Have you read the question? I don't know, I'm trying to summarize it. It's long.
I read, maybe we need to summarize it for the audience, I guess.
Yeah, could you try to do that, please?
Yeah, I think the question is about whether we contradict ourselves when we say that the violence is not natural or not essentialist, and that it's not non-avoidable. And then how we justify the basically state relations, which has the monopoly over violence to prevent chaos, for example. And the author brings the example of Georgia. So how would justify that this is basically something wrong?
Yeah, sorry for interrupting. I think the last part, maybe we should address that. It says that since you don't see violence as avoidable and you don't like the monopoly of state on it either, what do we propose? What do you prefer?
Yeah. Okay. Do you want to start, or should I start?
Maybe you go. I think you will have position on that.
Okay, let me try. I think the first part is, I think that's rightly mentioned. I think needs to a clarification from our side about the essentialist part of the violence and its non-avoidance. So what I meant by saying that the violence shouldn't be essentialized, I think the problem, what I see, is in the current dominant discourse that comes from, for me, from the realist Hobbesian perspective, that justifies the monopoly of the state over violence, saying that this is the only way, basically, if human beings are violent, and we don't have any other option than to give up some part of our political activism or our political agency to the state, so that this entity governs this violence. What I was trying to say is, I think violence is not, it's socially constructed thing. So in which form this violence will appear will differ from context to context. What is maybe essential or natural for human beings is the aggression, and it doesn't mean that it will always end up in a structural violence that we have in our societies. And I don't see problem, to be honest, with a direct violence necessarily. I don't think it's avoidable, because that part is not avoidable, because even in a perfect utopian society, for example, the human beings will have arguments with each other, or will can engage in some form of physical violence. For example, someone can get drunk, or etc., right? This is, I think, is not avoidable, in the sense that then we shouldn't even strive to avoid this type of things. What is avoidable is the structural forms of violence, which are problematic in our societies that we live today, and the form of its organization in a state monopoly that the author mentions, that with democratically elected government. I think the problem is here in the idea that we gave up our we voluntarily gave up our rights or our political, again, agency to the government. I think this is the structure, the democracy that we have today, and the example of Georgia is broad. This is a structure which is not questioned. And for example, if people are starting to question the structures, they are violently suppressed. And I'm referring to the groups both on the left and on the right, because the questioning of this democratic system not only comes from the left wing, also comes from the right wing. And in whether we voluntarily gave up our political agency to the state and there was a social contract, this is also a very, very debated question. So there is not a single opinion on this, that this is how it happened. And whether we agree on this or not, I think this is where the debate is happening. So basically, aggression and physical direct violence can be natural thing, but how is structural violence is happening? This is not natural and socially constructed. And basically what I would argue is to question how we control and organize this violence. So whether the state form of organization of this violence is the right way, and to what extent we as the citizens, or we as the political agents, have any say or have any ability to question and question this organization of structure.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot. Just few maybe things to add on that. Again, I second your opinion that any reference to nature, whether it's that, it's natural to be violent or it's natural to be peaceful, I think they are pretty problematic. And you can, if you refer to the nature, you can really find all kinds of violence and all kinds of coexistence. And that's how diverse different coexistences and social structures also in our realm. And regarding even if we normalize the fact that state has the legitimacy of committing violence, and we have that social contract and agreed on that, I think the very problem even with state functioning with how I think that this distancing of how bureaucracy works, how that is designed, and then how it's implemented in any sphere, actually, including police and army, and how violence is committed. That distance is so huge that there is no even, and I think at least here, if we want a more moderate position, I think at least this needs to be vocally criticized, how that processes are implemented, are happening, how that policies and bureaucratic processes are actually translated into action for the society, for people that agreed, to give all that rights to the state. So I think even if we look into that, I think this also perpetuates all that structural violence of in different forms and shapes. Yeah.
Yeah, I fully agree with your comments. I think we don't have any further questions.
Yeah, we have 5 more minutes. I hope our audience found our conversation helpful, or at least thought-provoking. I don't think we really had any clear positions on any of these concepts. This is something that we think and discuss outside of the record, outside of this webinar. And we just wanted to share some of it with you, again, by really believing that this kind of discussions also give us food for thought on then how to translate it into more effective interventions or activities that we do as practitioners, or into research questions, or how to study and our social life and the conflicts surrounding us.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And I think Margarita mentioned this, that we are trapped in this, speed of life, speed of the things happening in life, and a lot of conflicts and violence erupting around us, and we don't have really time to stop and think and conceptualize some things. And we don't claim that we did. We just hope that we stirred some kind of conversation, and the follow-up will come up from different groups to this question.
Mm-hmm. Okay, then maybe we conclude with this 4 minutes earlier. I think no one really minds that. And yeah, follow us on social media for more to be up to date about our this series, as well as other webinars more on kind of ongoing political processes. And again, this series will be published on YouTube, as all other webinars we had.
And the next webinar will be on nationalism, and will be on May 19 by Philip Gamagiljana and Mirkamran Hussein Lee. So yeah, please join that one as well.
Okay.